My name is JayTheZoomster, and I am the slowest content creator alive. 8 months ago, I started a series talking about the pilot of one of my favorite shows ever, and I promised to do more episodes. Sadly, and unfortunately, like the lazy asshole I am, nothing ever came of it. But now, I'm here attempting to fix it and set everything right. This is pilot season. Yo, welcome to Pilot Season, the show where I talk about pilots of popular television series, and I also break down whether or not I liked it and if I'm going to continue watching the show. That's not so much true for this episode, though, as I'm talking about one of my favorite shows ever that I've seen a lot of, The Flash. I definitely do want to apologize for the lack of this series over the last 8 months. I plan to do a lot more with it, but ultimately my ideas were just bigger than my will to actually work on it. This isn't even the episode I planned to do for episode 2, but I figured if I was going to bring the show back, I just really wanted to do it on something I loved and actually wanted to talk about, as opposed to my original plan, which was a show that I wasn't a big fan of. So that's why we're doing this. Quick little backstory about me and the show. I first saw the pilot of its predecessor show, Arrow, when it premiered in 2012. Rest in peace, Arrow. You will be missed. I didn't think anything much of it because I was pretty young, but after I thought about it a little bit more, I was like, yeah, it's decent. Then I watched the Flash pilot in 2014, 2 years later, after it leaked after Comic-Con, and I really enjoyed it. I wasn't much of a TV guy. I only really watched Doctor Who, and even then my interest in that show was waning, so I never really got into it until like 2015, when I just one day came home from school, sat down, and binged the show. And I was hooked. I watched the entirety of season 1, and then I eagerly awaited each episode of season 2, and I've been watching ever since, honestly. And from the absolute highs of seasons 1 and 2 to the pretty low lows of 3, the utter complacency and mediocrity of 4, and the fun thrill rides that have been 5 and 6, I've stuck with the show through thick and thin. And I think the reason why, honestly, still links back to the pilot. And it's because it's one of the best pilots I've ever seen. So let's talk about why that is. But before that, do you like my epic content? Well, if so, you can check out the JayTheZoomster podcast on Anchor and wherever else you might get your podcasts. It's not much right now, but it's an extension of my work, and I'm sure it'll fill up with interviews, movie reviews, TV reviews, and more. So go to anchor.fm/JayTheZoomster and check it out. So what actually does make the Flash pilot so good? Well, I think it's a mixture of 3 things that every good pilot like this show needs to have. Number 1 is an interesting premise. Number 2 is a reason to care, and number 3 is interesting and exciting world building. I call these the 3 pillars, and let's go ahead and talk about each of these in depth and why The Flash does it really, really well. Starting out, of course, we have pillar 1, which I said was an interesting premise. And The Flash really already had this handled after being based on a comic book, but the pilot is actually no stranger to being interesting alongside it. If you have no knowledge of the Flash comics, be okay, because you can leave that at the door and just enjoy the show as is. Starting out with a brief monologue about the impossible, the pilot actually never once lessens up about showing you everything interesting the show has to offer. Even Barry's mundane life as a CSI is interesting and entertaining. Why is he late all the time? How's he still hired? How's his work life? Do we care? Well, I certainly do. And the show takes its approach to superheroics and powers in a lot more, albeit still comic booky, grounded direction, having his abilities linked to the Star Labs particle accelerator. Really cool idea. I actually fucking love it, and I think it's a really cool way to tie everything together and make it a bit more grounded, which again, still, a lot of things don't check out and make sense. I also think it helps keep the show a little bit more connected to Arrow and make it feel like it's a bit more in the realm of possibility that these shows are actually in the same world, so it doesn't feel like a big tonal jump from the gritty, more street-based Arrow to, oh wow, they're superheroes now. And this also allows it to stand out from its comic book source material and feel a lot more like a sci-fi show than a superhero show. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still very much a superhero show, and none of the science is really true. Half of it's just babble, but it never really feels like babble here in the pilot. It actually feels like these guys know what they're talking about, and it's a very interesting way to give us the explanations for Barry's powers. It makes the show feel a lot more interesting, like I said. Pilot just works like a mini movie to set up its premise. It gives us all these interesting things and shows us that this show is unique. It just gets us to know about the world, and eventually it will make us care. So let's talk about that. Moving on to pillar 2, we have a reason to care. The Flash also, like in its first pillar, wastes no time giving us a reason to care. And if you had watched Arrow prior, you'd already know the gist of this Barry Allen. His mother was murdered by something he couldn't explain, his father took the fall, and he spent the next few years searching for the unexplained. And it's very much the same here too. Luckily, you do not actually have to watch his introduction episode on Arrow, because the show explains all of this and more in an instant. In a flash, if you will. I hate myself. It also introduces us to Iris West and Joe West, two very important people to Barry that he cares about, and we will also grow to care about it so quickly into this pilot and the show as a whole. By framing the episode around the opening narration that I mentioned earlier and giving us brief flashbacks throughout, I think the pilot does a brilliant job helping you develop a bond that causes you to care with the characters and care about the world and everything around it. It's just a great way to get invested in the show, and the fact that the show is able to do it so quickly is just exciting and interesting to me. Meeting Dr. Wells, Cisco, and Caitlin was exciting, and seeing how they'd help Barry during his coma was very interesting because, again, you felt like you were Barry. You were really put in his shoes and had to adjust to the world after that and these new people. And meeting Eddie was the same way. After 9 months and seeing him now dating Iris, Barry's longtime crush and arguably only love, you can really feel what this means to him and how much it bothers him. It makes you care. So that's really, really great. The episode's cliffhanger also does a fantastically amazing job about making you care, but I'll talk about that in Pillar 3. So now we're moving on to the final pillar, interesting world building. And much like the other two pillars, within a second, the Flash gives us exciting world building. Even from the first flashback scene in his house that night, you're already raised questions. Who's the guy in yellow that killed Barry's mom? Who's the guy in red too? Is it the Flash? How's the Flash there if Kid Flash is right there? And these are all questions that we'll get answers to in time, but the world is built from the get-go in such a creative and exciting way. And harkening back to the uses of pseudoscience that I talked about earlier, it really does help to build the world in that way too, by explaining that, hey, in this world, a particle accelerator explosion infused with dark matter can give a dude super speed. Who would have thought? You get a feel of how Central City feels just from the opening. You get a feel of how Central City feels just from that first scene with Barry on the case. You get a feel of how Star Labs operates even just from that opening, and you know how supervillains are going to be in this series just from Clyde Martin. It really does help set the tone of the world, and it works alongside the interesting premise and the making of us care that you actually really understand everything going on. I also mentioned that cliffhanger, right? Yeah, that cliffhanger is also insane. Setting up something literally 10 years in the future, showing us that there is definitely something up with Dr. Wells. It just wraps the entire episode together and does all three of that. It gives you an interesting premise, it makes you care, and it really has interesting world building. Tying all three pillars together, you can see why I think that's something The Flash does really well. And if you weren't interested in the show before now, I genuinely do think that after this cliffhanger, you'll be interested in it and excited to start it. So those are the three pillars that I think make The Flash's pilot great. Of course, these are all just really super broad strokes. The episode also nails its tone and vibe from the get-go, has amazing emotional and hilarious moments. There's also a really awesome Arrow cameo. But I didn't just want to make this a review of the pilot. I really did want to talk about the fundamentals of why it works and why I love it so much. And I think I did that in a pretty interesting and great way. The Flash's pilot really just functions as an awesome mini movie to get you interested. There's the opening, the middle act where the hero questions himself, and then the climax to tie it all up, as well as lingering questions to keep you really, really wanting more. It's easily one of the most rewatchable episodes of the series for me, and I think it is for a lot of people too. It consistently ranks as one of the top episodes of the show, which I think is the same for a lot of shows, but in the Flash's case, it's definitely worth it, as this is one of the best episodes of the entire show, and really just the Arrowverse as a whole, in my opinion. So that's pilot season episode 2. What'd you think? Is the show still good? What do you think about The Flash? Go ahead and leave your thoughts on the pilot or the show as a whole below. I would love to see those comments about it, and I'd love to know what everyone thinks. I definitely have a lot more content about this show planned, so be on the lookout for that. There's also going to be a lot more pilot season, and if you want more pilot season, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. It really helps, and suggest down below whatever pilot you want me to talk about. Go ahead and check out my Twitter, because I do be popping off there. That's all for this time on pilot season. I hope you had a great time, because I know I had a great time talking about The Flash, and I will almost definitely see you in the next episode. Have a great and amazing night.